Some days ago, I found myself in a very interesting conversation. That kind of conversation that starts small, and before you know it, everybody has an opinion about it. Like everybody around you has something to say about it. And that is exactly what happened that day. A question came up, and I know many of us have heard about such before. Someone said, since women are more than men in the world, doesn't it make sense that men should marry more than one wife? Otherwise, who will marry the rest of the women in the world? Now, after hearing such, I paused. Not because I don't have what to say, not because I'm short of words or because I don't have any idea of such, but it's because many of us have had such and we don't really think deeper before we respond to such. Yes, we don't think deeper before we reply to such. So today, I'm going to be answering that question. You see, when we talk about marriage, we need to ask ourselves something first. Like, are we building our understanding based on statistics, or are we building our understanding from God's design, from God's pattern, from God's design of marriage, or from God's kind of pattern of marriage? Because those two things I mentioned, they are very, very different. Understanding from statistics and understanding from God's design or from God's patterns of marriage, those two things are very, very, very different, and we should take note of that. If marriage was simply for making sure every woman finds a husband, then the conversation would have been shifted towards that direction. The conversation would have been shifted towards that direction. But if you look at how marriage was first established, that wasn't the reason. The reason was not because of statistics. No. The reason was not because of that. From the beginning, when God created marriage, the pattern was very clear. The scripture says that a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. Not a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wives. He said to his wife, that is one. He did not say three. The scripture says one, to be joined to his wife, and the two of them will become one. One wife, one husband, one union. One man, one woman, one union. Not two, not three, but one. And that pattern, you see, it is very, very essential in a man's life, because it tells us that marriage was not created to solve population imbalance, but it was created for God's design. A place of partnership, a place of responsibility, a place where two people build together under God. That is what marriage was created for. It was created as a covenant. It was created as a place for partnership. It was created as a place of responsibility and a place where two people build together under God. So, when people said women are more than men, the real question should become this: does a numerical difference automatically give us permission to redesign what God has already established? That is what the question should now turn into. Because once we begin to adjust God's design based on conveniency, then other things can easily be adjusted, and that is where wisdom is needed. Now, someone might say, but women are more than men. Yes, that is true. That is actually the fact. I'm not even arguing about that. Yes, it is true. But if you read those stories very well, carefully, you will also notice some things, that those homes were full of rivalry, conflicts, and jealousy. And we have such stories even in the Bible. Abraham, Jacob, and so on. Yes, the Bible recorded those stories. The Bible recorded those situations. but the Bible never presented them as the original design, as the original template, the original pattern. So the question about who will marry the rest may sound logical on the surface, but it assumes something that is not necessarily true. Yes, it assumes something that is not necessarily true at all. That is not necessarily the truth. You see, marriage is not guaranteed to everybody simply because they exist. Marriage is a calling. Marriage is a covenant. And marriage is a responsibility. And it must be treated as such. It must be treated as a calling, as a covenant, and as a responsibility. You don't just get married because you exist. No. It is not guaranteed to everybody. It is a calling. And it needs to be treated as such. It is a covenant. And it needs to be treated as a covenant. It is a responsibility, because we have a lot of responsibility in it, and it needs to be treated as such. And the moment we reduce it to a distribution system, making sure that everyone is fair, that a woman is fair, a man is fair, trust me, we have lost the weight of what it was meant to be. Yes, we have lost the weight of it being called a calling. We have lost the weight of it being called a covenant, and we have also lost the weight of it being called a responsibility. Making sure that everyone is paired, making sure that a man is paired, a woman is paired, turning it into a distribution system. We have lost the weight of what it was meant to be, because that is not the original template. No, it wasn't. That was not the pattern. That was not God's design for it. God designed for it to be a calling, a covenant, and a responsibility. So why do we want to turn it into a distribution system? Why? So instead of asking, how do we make sure that every woman gets a man? Maybe the question could have been this: how do we make sure that everyone follow God's design pattern of marriage? How do we make sure that everyone honor God's design pattern of marriage? How? Not making sure that everyone gets someone, but making sure that in that marriage we honor God. How do we make sure that everyone honor God's pattern of marriage, honor God's design of marriage? Because when we start from that, which is the foundation, then our approach to it becomes very, very different. And our answers to it also will be different, because we now understand the calling, we now understand the covenant behind it, we understand the responsibility carefully. And I think that is where the real conversation begins. When we understand it carefully, when we understand it as a calling, as a covenant, that we are called into this, we are called to do this, that we don't just get married for getting married sake, but we are called into it to fulfill something. We don't just marry just because we want to add to the numbers, but we are called into it because it is a calling. There is something that we need to fulfill out of it. There is a mandate that we need to do. And if you understand it as that, that is when the conversation begins. So in our next video, we'll talk about the second question that came up in the discussion, which is about marriage and divorce. That one also deserves careful and honest conversation. Yes, it deserves such also. But for now, I would really like to hear from you in the comment section. Bye.